Hey everyone, this is Peak Entertainment and we're back again, and here now we have another video and debate for you, and we're going to talk about boxing and Anthony Joshua, and following the recent fallout from his upset loss to Oleskandr Usyk, his points defeat against the Ukrainian resulting in him losing his WBA, WBO and IBF heavyweight titles. Now he does of course have a rematch clause, and we asked whether he will take it and if he should take it in order to get the rematch immediately. Now, just in case anybody who doesn't know, I've seen a lot of people asking online, why is there a rematch clause for a mandatory defense against Oleskandr Usyk? Well, Oleskandr Usyk was the mandatory defense for the WBO version of the title, and they had to put all of the belts on the line in order to initiate a rematch clause, because of course in a mandatory defense there is no rematch clause. So if they had just put the WBO belt on the line and Oleskandr Usyk had won, then they would have had to negotiate terms for a rematch, and of course then Usyk would have been in a position to charge a far higher split because he would have been the champion. So that's why they put all of the belts on the line, and then that's why they're able to exercise a rematch clause. For just in case anybody who was asking why is there a rematch clause for a mandatory defense. Now, in terms of the rematch itself, I think Joshua should take it, because he's still got a certain say in the overall belts and where they go. If he doesn't take it, then Usyk may go on to vacate a certain belt, because he'll have a certain amount of mandatories clogging up against him. As we all know, this is the dilemma when you have multiple belts. And then AJ will no longer have control over the heavyweight division and where it goes in the long run. So that's why I think he will take it. Now, of course, it's not quite as clear-cut, as simple as that. You, of course, have to consider the opponent he's facing and the adjustments that he will need to make for the rematch itself. Of course, he was in a very similar position when he lost to Andy Ruiz, if you remember the first time when he made his American debut. But the difference with Andy Ruiz was there was a clear strategy that Joshua could adopt in order to beat Ruiz in the rematch. He was the far taller man, he had the far bigger reach, he had the far bigger size, so he clearly could adopt the strategy in the rematch, which he did, where he used his jab, he used his reach, and was able to just keep Ruiz at distance. And of course, it didn't help the fact that Ruiz was largely unprepared and didn't really commit himself to the overall rematch. Now, the issue that he's got with Usyk is that Usyk is a far different personality. He's far more disciplined, he's far more committed. He's not going to slack off at all in the rematch. He's going to come in there fully prepared and far more confident in that second rematch, thinking that he'll be able to weather the storm and adjust to anything that Joshua throws at him. So it's a different type of strategy that Joshua's going to have to adopt when fighting Usyk in the overall rematch. Now, when we look at the first match overall, Usyk, of course, was far quicker, he was far more slicker, far more accurate with his punches. But I think a lot of what contributed to AJ losing was the fact that he was so gun-shy, he was so hesitant. You know, I thought AJ was going to stop him later on in the rounds, because I thought the size and the power would just be too much for Usyk. But AJ never really took it to Usyk. Straight away from the first round, Usyk was the man on the front foot. Usyk was the man who was throwing more punches, being way more assertive. And AJ was just too circumspect. Every time he would step forward, he just wouldn't throw punches. He wouldn't look to impose himself. He had various amounts of success in the middle rounds, I think particularly the fourth and the fifth round. And he thought this is when Anthony Joshua was really going to assert himself and really put the pressure on Usyk in the later rounds to get that later stoppage. But he never really did that. He was still too clunky. He was still too over-technical, too much thinking about his shots. And Usyk was just growing more and more in confidence. And I really think this is maybe a follow-on effect from the Ruiz fight. The fact, if you remember the first encounter, Joshua did look to take it to Ruiz. He did look to finish him off, and then he got countered. And I think ever since that experience, AJ has been really circumspect and hesitant in his performances post that Ruiz rematch. And this is just something we see always in boxing. When somebody has a great run and all of a sudden they have a shocking loss, it does play on them psychologically. We've seen this with so many other fighters throughout the years. They just become more hesitant because they're more worried about what's going to come back, how they're going to get countered if they miss certain shots. So they'll be a bit more hesitant, they're a bit more defensive, they're a bit more considerate in their approach. That can be to their advantage, because it can result in them not taking as much punishment and they can last longer in the fights, but at the same time it takes away that killer streak, that killer instinct, and that can cost him. And I think that's a lot of what cost AJ in this fight. When it really came to the pressure rounds, he didn't really put the pressure on, and of course, being a bigger man, I just think all of that overthinking, it just exhausted him mentally and over time physically as well. And he was very lucky, I think, in that last particular round. Had that gone on for another 30 seconds to a minute, I think Usyk would have overall got the stoppage against AJ. So he's got a lot of more variables to think about in the rematch, but I still think he should take it, because like I said, you don't know what would happen in the future if he decides to take 2 or 3 fights in the interim to try and get his confidence back and then go back into the rematch. Usyk could slip up against a further opponent, the belts could get dispersed, and then AJ will no longer be at the top of the heavyweight division. So that's why I think he should go back into the rematch. Now, of course, everybody's debating about what will happen in the third fight between Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, but I think in terms of AJ's position, I don't think that matters right now. I think that might be another element that might have contributed to this loss, is that of course everybody was talking about Fury and other fights, and that's something that could be very distracting. At this moment in time, that's not the priority. I think that's just him now trying to get back in the gym, and really he's got to think more, how can he come back? So if he does take the rematch and he loses, does this mean the end? Will that mean the big end for Anthony Joshua's career? Well, technically no, because he can still carry on as boxing. He's still very hugely popular amongst the fans. He's still, I would say, alongside Canelo, the biggest superstar within the sport of boxing. Now, obviously, a second loss against Usyk would really damage his marketability, and of course, then the huge amount of hype and interest would be removed from a casual fan standpoint, I would say. A lot of Anthony Joshua's fans are casuals, and they look very much having this huge, big heavyweight who looks the part, acts in the right way, behaves himself very professionally. I think that's the main attraction to Joshua. He did bounce back against Ruiz, and to an extent his stock had increased from that comeback win against Ruiz. But I think if he were to suffer another loss against Usyk, and if it was more comprehensive this time round, it will be very hard for AJ's promoters to really sell him as this huge commodity within the sport of boxing. Now, people may say even if he loses, he's still got big fights against Tyson Fury, or he could fight Wilder, for example, but those fights wouldn't have the luster, they wouldn't have the same attraction, because for me, the big attraction of the AJ Fury fight was the undisputed, the fact that we could have a historic encounter which would result in giving us the first undisputed champion since Lennox Lewis, and also the first British world heavyweight undisputed champion. But that's gone in many ways, and the other attraction was that we were seeing the 2 top fighters within the division. Well, that's gone as well now, because now the top fighter in the division at this moment in time is Oleskandr Usyk, and he would cement that status if he were to beat AJ again in the future. So I think if AJ were to lose the rematch, any interest in a match of Fury or even a match against Wilder would deflated massively. So it would still make money, I suppose, but just not the mega millions that it could have made when both fighters were at the top of the division. And I just think it's an important lesson in terms of making these fights, striking the iron when it's hot. This is again a result of not making these big fights when the demand is there for it. AJ could have fought Wilder. There was no obstacle standing in the way of that. I truly believe had they fought at the time when both fighters were champions, it would have done at least 2 million pay-per-view buys. So they massively missed out on that opportunity. We all know the stories, the back and forth in terms of the negotiations. And then, of course, they've missed out on the opportunity of making AJ and Fury. Now, that was more on the blame of the side of Frank Warren and Bob Arum, because they tried to make out as if they were interested in the fight. But they, of course, had this arbitration clause with Deontay Wilder in the background, and they should have resolved that first before making any inclination of making the fights with Fury. So it just shows, again, you've got to make these fights when they're most popular. You never know what will happen down the line in the future. This is heavyweight boxing, the most powerful punches within the whole sport, and everything could end in one punch. And as we've seen twice now, AJ is susceptible. He's very vulnerable to losing against a lesser known name or not as big a fighter, whether it be Andy Ruiz or Alexander Usyk. So I just think this is an important lesson to be learned for all promoters in terms of making these fights when really they are at their most peak in terms of popular interest and bankability. But just going back to Joshua again, I just think he should jump back for the rematch. If he loses, I think he would probably retire, because where else could he go? Not only would the desire not be there as such, but also the confidence would not be there as such, because if you can't beat Usyk and if you struggle to beat Andy Ruiz, if you remember, he didn't destroy Ruiz. That was much more of a tactical win. That wasn't a huge, dominating, imposing win over Andy Ruiz. If he loses again to Usyk, I really think he would probably retire. You know, he's got more than enough money. He'll be around, what, I guess, 31, 32 years old. He'll have all of his senses intact, you know, and that's the ultimate goal for any boxer. You want to go in, have as many fights as you can, make as much money as you can, and then come away with all your faculty still in check. And I think a second loss to Usyk, especially if it was much more of a convincing loss, I think that would really shake the confidence out of him. Now, of course, all of his promoters, Eddie Hearn, whether Joshua re-signs with DAZN or Sky, they'll want to keep him going, but the attraction won't be there. Especially a lot of casual fans who will then, I think, abandon Joshua, because obviously as a fan you lose confidence if your fighter is consistently losing against the top guys. And the argument will be made that Joshua has lost to fighters who are in his prime. If we look at his biggest fights, whether it be against Klitschko, Povetkin, Pulev, all of those fighters were really in their later years. Most of them were 38, 39, 40 years old. But when he comes up against fighters in their prime, he has lost. So again, it's going to give that further impression that when he comes up against the true elite fighters within his division, he's always going to come up short. So that's why I think if he does lose to Usyk, then he will eventually retire from the sport. I mean, he's had a great career, no doubt about this. He's had a fantastic career. He's made so much money. He has been the biggest superstar within the sport. There'll be no shame if he does retire from any eventual rematch against Usyk. I just think he should take the rematch now. In terms of potential strategy, I think he's got to be far more aggressive. I think he's got to take it to Usyk. He's got to look to rough him up, be much more of a bruising and brutal style, abrasive, aggressive style. Really look to attack the body of Usyk. Really look to lean on him, pressure him in the corner. Really look to adopt far more roughhouse tactics, use his size, use his power, and look to really put a lot of pressure on Usyk. If he tries to fight a much more of a technical fight, then Usyk is too skilled, he's too accomplished in that field, and I think that was probably the biggest fault within Anthony Joshua's performance in this first fight. So that's what I think would happen in an eventual rematch. I think AJ's got to be far more aggressive, look to exhibit far more of his power and his size, and hopefully he can shake a bit of the confidence out of Usyk. Really go for a much more of an earlier stoppage. That's what I would go for in any particular rematch against Oleskandr Usyk. But we will wait and see. But that's my overall opinion. I think AJ should take the rematch. If he doesn't, where else does he go from here? You know, he could score a money fight against Fury or Wilder, but again, that won't have the same luster. And of course, coming off a loss, who's to say if he loses against Fury or Wilder, where does he go after that, right? Because it'll be a lot more harder for him to get any potential rematch of Usyk if he were to fight against Fury and Wilder and lose in that match as well. So those are my overall thoughts and feelings on Anthony Joshua and his recent fallout from his loss against Oleskandr Usyk. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Can AJ bounce back from this, or do you think this is the beginning of the end of his career? If he were to take the rematch and lose against Usyk, do you think he can still come back against Fury or Wilder, or do you really think it's time for him to pack up his bags and just retire from the sport? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Please also hit and like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.